I am, for the sake of the recording and for the sake of anybody who hasn't seen me before, I am Angus Jenkinson but you can probably see that because my name appears next to my image. And I'm very glad to welcome you to this FCybS session. It's called Probing HS2, but it's really more an exploration about large projects and how we go about large projects. Large projects are things that change the world. And the general principle is that human beings, since thousands and thousands of years ago, have been about the business of changing the world. We have evidence that Neolithic people burned down quite large areas of forest, for example, as part of processes of living, growing certain things. They used fire for hunting. They made small dams. They made use of things. They've been changing. We human beings have been changing the world for thousands of years, and as a result of engineering techniques, design techniques, we've been finding ways to intervene into the world to make life more comfortable and pleasant for ourselves, but not always more comfortable and pleasant for the living world around us. And sometimes it's privileged small groups. You can think about Romans with slaves down the mine, for example, sometimes working in awful conditions. But supporting the Roman civilization and its infrastructure. Well, what we have in Britain is a large controversial project. It's called HS2. For any of you who are not familiar with it because you're not British, it basically was intended or is intended to form a connection between London and the north of England. Like a number of other countries, there is a discrepancy between the north and the south. It's a very common feature, north and south, but it might be east and west. It might be center and for example, in America, you have the two coastlines and then the middle and so on, the Midwest. At any rate, there's differences in different parts of the country, just as there are differences in different parts of the world. And the idea was that a railway, very fast, connecting the two would improve transport. It would be good for the environment because it would mean that people would drive less. It could be done, it was believed, in such a way that it was ecologically sound. It would build infrastructure for the future. And one of the characteristics of the modern world is that you can see that in a country like Britain, America, France, Germany, and so on, there's an immense amount of built infrastructure, which creates huge differentiation when compared with other countries. If you visited India and seen, for example, open sewers, and you compare it with the sewage system that was built in London in the 19th century, which is now being replaced by another huge construction project, or upgraded at any rate. It's still, much of it is still working. Then you can see what a very significant difference that is. Another very important construction project was the Underground, which changed the way London works. And some of the other cities in the north didn't have those benefits. And when they did have things like tramways, they got closed down and not always helpful. And you compare that again with the kind of mass transportation that you'd find in many cities around the world. Or the absence of mass transportation. So construction industries can make a great deal of difference to civilization, but they're also often controversial. They're often seen as white elephants. And the construction industry around the world, and certainly in Britain, was notorious. I got involved in several conferences and projects about 10, 12 years ago when the construction industry was understood to be the worst industry in Britain in terms of quality, overruns in cost, lack of delivery, and so on. So we're not at this point trying to diagnose HS2 in detail and say, do we agree with it or don't we agree with it? We're simply using it as a provocation. And so if you know nothing at all about HS2, don't worry. What we're exploring is, if you want to go about changing our infrastructure, if you want to do something to change the world, our infrastructure in the world, in such a way that it makes a better world for us, a better future for us. What does cybernetics tell us about how to go about doing that? And I think that this large-scale project like HS2 can be scaled down to small-scale projects. I know a number of you are involved in practical small-scale. Unlike the usual process, we haven't got one major speaker who's delivering forth. I'm quite pleased that we don't have a large gathering in this, because we can have a more intimate conversation, we can have more flow and more involvement, and that will perhaps lead to a better conversation in the long run. So I invite us all to participate, but a few people have offered to say something and to contribute, some of whom have actually managed to join the meeting, but not all. Benjamin is one of them. Benjamin offered to say something. As I have no idea what
but not at the start, Angus.
is, I'm asking you if you might kick us off, Benjamin. What do you think?
Oh, fine. I've just literally just sent you a direct message saying, as I've had little time to prepare, I'd rather listen to some other people first. I'll start with some unsorted thoughts, if that's okay. I feel very intimidated, in as much as speaking to this society, it would always be such, given the breadth of the brains in the room and depth. I am not in my preferred area of expertise by any means with this topic. So I was invited to try to give cybernetic perspectives on this. And that's been really interesting and puzzling to me. What the kind of 5 things that I want to flag up, having really only had a background knowledge of this, and read the extremely well-written and readable Okavi review amongst some of the other materials highlighted in the Eventbrite, is if a cybernetician is a person who observes what might have happened but didn't, then it's certainly the case that you wouldn't want to start from here with HS2 in a number of different dimensions. And I'll talk a little bit about those in the next couple of minutes. I think there are a number of really interesting circularities to try to pull out here, where framing and understanding of the situation have driven assumptions which drive the framing in a very self-referential loop. The simplest of which is that if we had HS2, no doubt we would value it, and it's the not having of it which makes it contested, which I think is a really interesting, starting point to think about. I think it's also interesting, and I haven't done the necessary work to fully work this through, but I think what we see set out, at least in the Okavi review, is a hierarchy of values or problems, where one option A is preferred over option B, option B is preferred over C, C is preferred over D, but D is preferred over A. So we get this eating its own tail challenge of how do we prioritize. There is no obvious hierarchy of choice and selection. And what that says to me is that what we would want to do, although if you were asked to take a pressing look at what can immediately be done about the situation of HS2, over time, over budget, uncertain in value, but too expensive and too late to be cancelled with too many implications, you wouldn't start there. Would be to look at the context. Would be try to reframe and try to understand in a completely different way the context in which we are seeing the challenge. So I think that's, depending how you look at it, 3, 4, or 5 different points. What might have happened but didn't, and what light does that shed on the situation? How could we work on the context and think about reframing? What are the circularities at play here, both of value and of self-fulfilling prophecy in the thinking which has led to the current situation, which I don't characterize as good nor bad because I don't feel confident to do so, partly because of the final point, which is we seem to be facing a heterarchy of values or problems. Some of the things that I picked out to try to illustrate some of those points are the really interesting challenge that the same people who are against HS2 for environmental reasons would value HS2 if we had it for environmental reasons. The same people who are against it as a grandstanding piece of government overspend are the ones who would contrast our high-speed rail situation with that of some of the major European countries or of Japan, etc. Now that we've got where we are, it would cost enormous sums to cancel it. We could just do part of it, but that would deliver little benefit. It's intended to generate levelling up, but without local investment, that will be difficult. And a likely outcome of improved travel times actually appears to be increased centralisation. I was very tickled by a recent study on commuting into London, which showed a small but statistically relevant proportion of people who currently commute to London from Aberdeen. So the centralisation of this country is something which will not be reversed by improved links into the centre. However, if we cancel and focus on local investment, nothing is shovel ready, and we will be behind on overall infrastructure investment. Obviously, physical connectivity seems now to be less necessary as a result of the pandemic. Yet, because people are working in more dispersed locations, they will want improved connectivity to connect physically over longer distances as opposed to simply local commuting. However, where they're choosing to live is not necessarily connected to the commute time that will be impacted by HS2. It seems likely that the pandemic will be with us in iterations for some time, making travel as a whole less likely, but car travel relatively more attractive. Clearly, there is an environmental benefit of train over car, but as cars electrify, the carbon impact reduces. There isn't one single mention of buses in the OKV review, which I thought was really fascinating, showing our limited focus. That wasn't the remit, I understand that, but our limited focus. And
you mean
actually,
uses or uses?
Sorry, on buses. Also
misheard it.
Omnibuses, Angus.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
Which I think is really fascinating. And one of the really interesting things is the discussion of the symbolic impact. It's a nice report for talking at multiple levels and has furnished me with thinking about multiple levels. On trust in the UK government, which I bracket with a ironic exclamation mark, on the sectors involved, on environmental considerations from both directions, symbolic impact on the desire to go for fast and flashy over boring and slow. And again, you know, it's very easy to second guess with retrospect. There seems to be a clear indication that if we had gone for a slower and less world-beating, to coin a phrase, version of high-speed rail travel.
So you're running out of time.
Great, excellent, good. I'm pleased to hear it. Also, the future of our European rail link connection is under threat for numerous reasons at the moment. So I wouldn't start here with lack of coherent transport strategy, lack of a coherent industry and skills strategy, but particularly transport. And I just want to close with the classic example of reframing, which I think is really useful to bring in here, which I call the Rory Sutherland argument, when he talks about reducing the travel time from London to Paris by 20 minutes, and for 1/100th or less of the cost, you could provide Wi-Fi which would allow the travellers to work productively for the entire duration of the journey, which has now, by the way, been done, and for I think 1/100th or some small fraction of the cost, you could actually employ the world's top supermodels to walk up and down the Eurostar, pouring champagne for the duration of the journey, and people would wish it lasted longer. So I think, you know, the opportunity to reframe, the opportunity to map out, but I lack the time and skills to do it. That hierarchy of values would be the places that I would start to provide a cybernetic perspective on this.
Okay, that's fantastic, Benjamin. And for a person who claims to have been unprepared and so on, that was really quite a riff. So there are a number of different aspects. I'm going to open it up to some brief responses from different people, then we'll get someone else speaking and so on. And so we'll get some points of view. We'll get some first responses, we'll get some points of view from different people, and then we'll have a general community conversation. So I picked up aspects about how one makes choices, the question about how the choices are integrated into a larger set of choices, the question about the context in which you start, how you might reframe those different choices, approaches, how you actually do it, what is the present situation, and what is the outcome that you're trying to achieve. So various aspects that came up in that excellent introduction. Thank you, Benjamin. Anyone want to respond or ask Benjamin a clarifying question?
Yeah, well, one thing that came to my mind from my old accountant boss years ago, sunk cost fallacy. It strikes several times, Benjamin, you mentioned it would be too expensive to scrap. Well, there is also the idea cybernetically is that when the kind of conditions change direction. And I think that sunk costs are not even, for me, should even be a consideration. Change direction when the facts change.
Agreed.
I can't argue with that. Very, very solid point. Yeah, really interesting. It's really notable that in the Oak Tree report, there's explicit consideration of sunk costs, almost named as such. There is, of course, the additional get-out cost and the loss of the investment is against a potential not dismissible benefit, isn't it? And what is the alternative is the question that keeps coming up throughout the report.
And I think another aspect to this is Possywood, you know, purpose of a system is what it does. The justification for HS2 has changed and changed and changed. And I mean, probably I shouldn't let it get to me, but a bit, you know, personal animus here. I find that this seems to be more about Lord Adonis's political career. I haven't seen anything remotely coherent he's ever said over the last 10 years. So it almost seems as if the purpose of this system is profoundly political. It has nothing to do with all the actual things that you quite rightly mentioned. You know, I mean, you were talking about the environment, you were talking about connectivity, all perfectly reasonable, quite persuasive. But maybe I'm a cynic. I see this as no more than generally political, specifically Lord Adonis's political career.
Okay, so there's a question about the process by which the decision making is being taken, the governance of it, and if you like, let's see, the clarity in which by which decisions get made. So in the last FCybS session that we had in the President series, the point was made that when you analyze the entire series of privatization projects, and this is looking at the internal documentation from cabinet and government and so on, every single one of those decisions was based on a political motivation rather than a technical evaluation. Someone else.
I'd like to ask a clarifying question because I'm not very familiar with the exact situation. If there wouldn't be any cost overrun or time overrun, would it be a problem? Would it be in the news? Or is this really the thing that's all about, the cost and the time, or is it about other things?
Anyone want to comment?
I would say it's other things. I mean, I come from Liverpool and my father comes from Hull. So of course, if one takes a big picture, I think in terms of prioritization, infrastructure investment should always have been prioritized to the north. It's falling apart, absolutely falling apart.
So the concept is it would be better to spend the money on integrating cities in the north.
Yes.
There's a northern powerhouse concept that got talked about at one point. So if an infrastructure, a mass communication infrastructure was created across a range of cities in the north of England, that would have bolstered it. And it was less important to connect the north, a few cities in the north, with London than to connect all of these cities to improve their connectivity and therefore capability.
Okay, thanks.
There's also issues some people think about the environment, counterclaims that in fact this is the most ecological project ever and it overall improves it as a result of things like tunneling in order to avoid damaging the environment. Janos is still with us somewhere. He hasn't left, has he?
Can't see him.
Ah, where has Janos gone? I was about to invite him to speak. Never mind.
Angus, I'm quite happy to throw my hat in the ring. I've got quite strong opinions on HS2.
Okay. Can I make one small request?
Yeah.
Please help us to understand the principles.
Sure.
Not simply the pros and cons of this one project as a project. Thank you.
The principles of HS2 or the principles of projects?
The principles of projects. We're using this as a tool to think about the next project that we might want to design, or even what to do about this one from now. But in general, what do we learn from, because cybernetics is a science that says it deals with design, it deals with interventions, it deals with context. So it's about how to achieve outcomes. A project achieves an outcome that is not the state today. And if we are competent in that field, we should have some point of view about how one does that in an effective way.
So cybernetically, as far as HS2 is concerned, just to pick on that for a second, is a sort of picking up on what everyone else has said. I think it comes back to feedback, because what the government, and I've had direct conversations with ministers about this, they are very resilient to taking any new information and ignoring it, or they're very good at taking new information and ignoring it. So from a cybernetic perspective, whatever feedback comes along, I mean, Benjamin was saying it's too expensive to stop. It is that they're not taking any feedback or whether it's likely to be successful. Forgetting the overruns, we're talking about out-of-date technology by the time it's actually built. And then there's the question that has been raised, if you like, in the last 2 years by COVID, as to whether we actually even need to travel at all. So it seems to be quite resilient to feedback that contradicts whether it should go ahead or not.
So what should one do about that?
Well, it's a bit difficult when it's a political, ideological process. Project-wise, so I do have a bit of a history with projects. The problem generally with projects, and I believe with HS2 and the overruns, is that they lack a full set of information as to what's actually going on within the project. So these projects are tremendously complex because they have multiple participants in them. And each of the participants generally have different systems of reporting. So the first thing they have to try and do is try and get all of the reporting systems used by all of these quite large organizations to somehow communicate with each other. So from the very start, you have a communications issue, even down to what systems they're using, what methodology they're using to report, whether that all is collated. And what they end up doing is they end up reporting in hindsight. And sometimes in very, and this goes for large building projects of all types, by the time they've collated the information together, and reported, they're actually reporting about 8 or 10 weeks behind the events that have happened that they're talking about. So when you're in an environment which is subject to very rapid change, which is the kind of, you know, what we're living in at the moment, generally, the ability to actually change direction, it's the old story about trying to change the direction of a liner. They're very, very slow at being able to correct. And in that space of correction, there are huge things like going off still in the wrong direction, costs, errors. It's just ridden with problems. And a lot of it comes down to the infrastructure of reporting and then decision making. And that can then be related across to the fact that those people involved in the systems that are utilized by these people for projects someone is pushing one system versus another system. So you end up with these multiple silos which don't communicate with each other. And then between the silos, what happens is the individuals use Microsoft Excel and other tools like it, but mostly Excel, to take data out of multiple silos, put it into an Excel spreadsheet, play around with it, and then produce a report. That information then doesn't have provenance because nobody knows what system all that information has been drawn out of, which allows some people to manipulate information in the way they want it to be understood, and then builds distrust within the system so that nobody can actually rely on whether the data is empirical or whether it's been played with, in inverted commas, for right or wrong purposes. So there is a massive communications problem in projects, and it is quite possible, although I can't guarantee it's the only cause, that most of the overruns of projects, because almost all big projects overrun, is actually attributable to this communications problem. So communications.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that you've given not an exhaustive, but a good list of problems with this, and you've particularly highlighted some of the informational aspects. Since we are trying to find how to do it and not how to not do it, some of the things that you've suggested might indicate, well, if in some way we could reverse that and do it the other way around, that would help. How about the following as a frame for the conversation? Do you have your hand up there, David, or is it just?
I'm ready to speak.
Go ahead.
Okay, so overall features as to why we've got high-speed 2. In the 30s, Keynes talked about how it would actually benefit the economy if one buried pound notes or whatever and then paid other people to dig them up. So there's the notion of the Keynesian multiplier, any infrastructure will do. And in an economy where some people are not doing things, arguably you can, if necessary, create the money to get them doing things. There's a tension between that and wage inflation, if you like, or the costs for other enterprises of wage inflation and all these tensions which Karl Marx and modern people talk about, the tragedy of the commons for capitalism. So is high speed 2 a good thing or a bad thing? I haven't seen the any kind of cost benefit analysis. I'm sure it exists, and I'm sure it's probably mostly wrong and irrelevant. Cost benefit analysis is a great principle, but very rarely done effectively or widespread enough. We've also got to recognize that politicians, not just politicians, unless they're in the treasury, build a reputation by doing things, and therefore doing things, preferably the more visible and obvious, the better. And an easy dream is easier to sell. Why do we get cost overruns? We've already had some reasons in, you know, dodgy information. Also remember, when you want to persuade somebody to do something, so the books tell me, you start with a small ask or a small cost and estimate, and ratchet it up as they become more committed and they become sort of vulnerable to the sunk cost fallacy. Is, given what we spent so far, is the, I don't know whether it's 100 billion now or that order of magnitude, going to deliver the 100 billions worth of value? Maybe, maybe not. Could you spend 100 billion more usefully? Absolutely, certainly. But the question is, do you? What kind of stimuli are you ready to put into the economy? And we could certainly, with the level of unemployment now or before lockdown, we could be doing more stuff. It's just got to be managed in a way which doesn't inflate things too badly for everybody. I note the sort of, I'm torn here about December 2019. I went on a walk with Chris Packham, the naturalist, and a few hundred other people down the Colne Valley, protesting about the devastation which High-Speed 2 is likely to create through there. That's already done now, I think, although they haven't built the railway. In August, I found myself having lunch with brunch with one of the chief designers of High-Speed 2, and she was reassuring me, well, we're going to plant just as many trees as we're killing, which isn't quite the point, because it takes a while to build an equivalent ecosystem. So, you know, if I were in charge of the government at the moment, I'd probably, given the damage done already, let it run. I mean, the problem with the north of England, it's less fertile. Did it all start with the harrying of the north by William the Conqueror? Well, that didn't help. Obviously, links between Leeds and Manchester, Lancashire and Yorkshire, you know, the War of the Roses is overdone. That would be a good thing too, but I'm not prepared to say, hey, let's just stop and start building another railway somewhere else, even though friends of mine or friends of friends have sort of buried themselves underneath Euston Square in a form of protest which hasn't been particularly effective.
Thank you, David. I find it intriguing how to explore a question like this in such a way that we can take account of various facts, in inverted commas, or perceptions about how the actual project is happening or what is happening, while without merely getting into the level of debate that occurs generally between people expressing their point of view, their opinion from their different situations. The challenge for a project, designing a project like this and deciding whether to do it, and if so, how, seems to me to be something that requires a way of analyzing, planning, and executing that transcends that approach. So
can I maybe add something? I think I can.
I'm just inviting that we go into this in such a way that we really try and explore what are the cybernetic tools that would enable this to be done more effectively. Ed, you wanted to contribute something. Sebastian, you had your hand up a little bit earlier. Your image is no longer there, so I don't know whether you were just had your hand up or whether you wanted to say something. But Ed.
Yeah, what I'm thinking, and it's something I do with a lot of my clients as well. It's a problem with large and also smaller projects I see. Organizations, I think, I see have a lot of difficulty keeping their eyes on the ball. It's a very basic premise of cybernetics or all systems thinking. What is your system in focus? Obviously, in this case, whether you agree with HS2 or not, it is to build a railway. And what very often happens in projects is that very soon people are not looking anymore at the railway, they're looking at the project plan. The project plan becomes the proxy, that becomes the system in focus. And if you look at the plan, that's exactly what you will get, more plans. And you see that constantly, plans upon plans upon plans upon plans. If something goes wrong, oh, we need another plan. It's once you see it, it's really, it's almost hilarious. It's so strange what we are doing, but this is I think a very basic problem in project management, whether it's small or large. Large is always worse than smaller, but I think that's one of the principles that we could make use of in project management. So that was my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, Jonathan, go.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm just thinking about in terms of the feedback loops, because there's something here about rolling forward into the future quite a long way. So if I thought about something like a bridge or a sewer or something, let's say, built in the Victorian era, there are things there that may actually have been vanity projects. And I guess infrastructure is quite rich territory for vanity projects because there's something very physical that everybody can see. But at the time, there may be certain projects that did not make sense if you were taking a 20, 30, 40-year view. But over a 200-year view, it might make a lot of sense. So I think in terms of the feedback, we're trying to project forward a vision of the future and then work out whether what we're doing now will make sense in that future. And if I compared that, say, to something like Concorde, looking back, probably wasn't worth it. If that had set the pattern and the technology for supersonic air travel, we'd look back and say that made perfect sense. And it was the foundation for everything that's come since.
I think that's a really useful. So that gives us the tool that says, let's look at this from different points of view and from different horizons. And that's a really classic cybernetic discipline. I mentioned earlier on the sewage system in London. When it was designed in the 19th century, it was a period when Britain was doing big engineering projects around the world. They had an ambition to get rid of, there were real problems with illnesses and things. They decided to eradicate it by having a good sewage system. So they said, let's really do this well. And then having designed it, they said, well, why don't we just double the capacity? So they doubled the capacity, and we've been running on that doubled capacity ever since, and it's been enormously important to the growth of London to have that infrastructure. So I'm going to suggest, what about the following? One of the tools in cybernetics is the notion of a situation. A situation is a very fundamental concept. It embeds the notion of an observer in the process. So in order for something to be a situation, it needs an observer to say, this is the situation. And where a number of people involved, such as all of the people currently talking, each of us is in our own situation. We're in our own homes probably, or offices. We're meeting, some of us can be seen, some of us know each other, some of us don't know each other, and so on. So in different aspects, there are different aspects of our situation. So layered into this concept of a situation are the aspects. And the aspects are the things that in a sense matter to make it the situation. It doesn't matter at the moment to me what the temperature of the room is, because I don't notice it being a problem. Therefore, it's not the aspect of the situation, is actually everything's fine in that respect. Now, if we take this, and aspects can be technically analyzed as a multidimensional descriptive space. It's a framework for being able to analyze a situation. So if you're thinking about a project, there's a situation that in some sense it is believed is not the situation you want to be in. And then there's another situation, and that's the situation you think you do want to be in. So we've now got situation now and situation in the future. And very often there's lots of analysis when you design solutions or interventions to solve problems, very often there's a lot of analysis of the present and a limited analysis of the outcome, the situation you want in the future. If you want to be successful, what you really need to do is to be clear, and that's an imaginative exercise, what is the future that we want it to look like? Now, that future that it needs to look like is something that involves various people. Well, what does it need to look like for whom? And in between, there's a process of saying, well, how will I get from here to there? And there is, in a sense, the situation of how it is currently being done and the situation of how it ought to be done. When the construction industry looked at itself and said, we're appalling, we really have to radically change, one of the members of the society is now engaged in a process of educating literally millions of construction people over time in better ways of working together. So you've got these three different aspects, each of which can be recursively analyzed. What is the situation today? What is the situation we imaginatively want to have in the future? And how will we get from A to B? And in order to do that, what we've said so far in the conversation is if the process of analyzing today is parochial, biased, to support one particular political party or the career or ego of somebody or to make some money for someone, then it doesn't take account of the multidimensionality. Even more particularly, if we don't consider the situation, the multidimensional situation of the future, with a kind of open-minded, comprehensive analytical frame, we will design problems into the solution. And similarly, the process in between. Now, I'm just wondering, as a framework, whether that might be something useful as a construct around which we could hang some exploration of process and conversation. I notice Gerard seems to be nodding his head. I'm not quite sure whether in agreement, disagreement, or just bafflement. Gerard.
You raise a very interesting question, which is a question that has come up already a number of times, the question of principle. And the question of principle is that we are all used to think about organizations and countries being structured by a hierarchy. So in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, there were manners and people were engaging 20 to 30 staff. So all these people are now somewhere else. They all contribute to situations, but we still think in terms of manners. So for example, we still think that if you have a number of people with similar needs, we provide them centrally. But there is another possibility, which is that actually you don't do that. You allow every single person to connect to the next person, but not to the overall system. So in terms of your situations, I am envisaging the network of different areas where people try to improve something. When you do that, eventually it is possible to result in some substructure that is useful for everybody. So I try to think of a number of examples. When I would organize an army, I would organize it locally. Every single soldier must know what it is that he or she, well, nowadays she, must do. And I would not organize it in the way of Eisenhower, I would organize it in the way of Nelson.
Say what you mean by that?
Nelson, in the Battle of Trafalgar, made sure that all his commanders knew exactly what they were supposed to do locally, given what they were supposed to do globally. So he said to them, make sure that you engage each other's ship orthogonally, because then you can actually make it possible for other ships to do what they want to do in the same way. So he was one of the first to do things like that. Well, many people have done it before, but he was very clear about what he did. So what I'm trying to say is we are so used to think that any type of communication goes from the lower to the higher, whereas what we really would like to do is to from the higher to the lower. I've been engaged in helping to develop the medical system, and the major problem was always that the GPs wanted to be central. And so they refused to accept the possibility of sending information to have it locally. They always wanted it to be sent to the GP. Nowadays it has changed, but that was my fight 10 years ago.
Right. So if you start with the situation that the north of England is economically doing less well than the south of England, and that it's less well served with transportation, and you believe that transportation in the modern world is really important for a flourishing society, let's suppose that was an analysis that was done. Just hypothesize. Doesn't matter whether that's actually the reality, hypothesize that. And the north of England consists of a series of cities across a band, across roughly the northern part, that are more lateral, left to right. There's some north to south in that band. And I say left to right, I obviously mean east to west. And so there's a question that says, well, they're not so well connected to London. London is doing really well. London's the big hub. It's the big economic center. It's a huge part of the economy. Okay, so what should we do? How would your principles apply to that?
Well, I live in a very small village. We have 93 inhabitants. Even with this small group of people, we can make sure that the village knows what it wants to do. Then we connect with the next village. Now, in this area, due to actually my partner and me, there is now a whole group of villages that actually are organizing meetings, village ventures and things like that. So the whole point is that originally each individual village was independent of the others and didn't know what to do. We said, you don't have to know what the others do what you want to do yourself. Then they got together.
Right. So that's kind of a bit like the reframing that Benjamin brought up at the beginning. If the problem is that the northern economy is not so thriving, what could be done to help the northern economy to thrive? And the start point would be, what could be done that would involve spending nothing at all, actually, that would be transformative? And if we are going to spend money, where do we spend it in such a way as to facilitate a sustained transformation that actually benefits the people that you want to benefit?
Yes. So my first search would be, what are the local resources where people are actually quite good in using?
Louis, you had your hand up.
Angus.
Yeah, thank you.
Hang on one moment, Raoul, I'll come to you.
Yeah.
So but I've been really enjoying listening to everyone talking, and for me what was coming up was, oh, hang on a minute. There's a really fundamental assumption that we're not addressing here, which is the assumption that we can and should control the natural environment in any way that, as if we are godlike. And I think the point that Gerard is making is actually bringing us back to our localities. And one of the difficulties, I think, with the way in which man, I've noticed I'm one woman on camera, and I was up for a bit, is, you know, how exercised we can become in managing and trying to make big projects happen without questioning who for, what for. And I've spent a lot of my life in the kind of participation and engagement space, in local government initially, And you know, one of the bits that have really brought me home is working in ways that actually awaken people to the agency they have to do something about their own lives. And I think that's what Gerard's talking about. And I think, you know, we've got some really fundamental questions that we have to question ourselves about, which is who the hell keeps making these decisions about these grandiose statements when it's about more, to have more, to have more, to have more, to have more. And look what it's doing to the planet. You know, there is one of the gifts I think we have from COVID is it's anchored us all locally. It's like, wake up to what's actually in range. And if all of us start attending to what's in range, then something different happens. Nature starts being able to play its game again. And currently, what we, you know, maybe that's what COVID's doing, is saying, get back in your box, guys.
Is it about either or? For example, I don't know where you currently are, Louis, but I'm in the Cotswolds in England, and I think Gerard is not in England at the moment, and I think probably there are some other people like Boris, who's over in Eastern Europe somewhere, I think. So we're distributed around the globe, or parts of the globe a little bit, and we're together because there's an infrastructure called the internet and the software and so on that enables it. Yet at the same time, what we're actually doing is engaging as individuals in the process, in exactly so that it's not about one or the other. It's about, in some sense, both together being necessary.
Yeah, and we've got to be really careful about stepping into omnipotence.
Yes.
And I think we haven't got that message yet.
That's right. Oh.
We haven't got that message. And I mean, I don't know if any of you have come across the work of a guy called Rayner, who was a mycologist, a biologist. And what he's really drawing out is this principle of natural inclusion. And it's a real challenge to fundamental science and thinking and biology and Darwinism. And you know, it's a really...
So I missed the word, Louis. Natural what is he drawing out?
Natural inclusion. And it's a really simple principle, which, you know, you get through your beingness rather
what is it?
than
Explain it.
Very simply, receptive space invokes the inflowing of responsive energy. Yeah.
Yes.
Now, what's so potent about that is it flips around this whole notion about what is power and the power to make what happen. So if you hold that receptive space is the invoking power, then proactivity and thrusting and forcing and making things happen is actually contrary to nature's way.
If I remember rightly, mycology is to do with fungi and things like that, and their role in connecting plants together, forests together, and things like that in communication systems, and generally their role in communication is really being discovered, and it's really fabulous, that whole field.
And I think the important thing about mycology, because this was, you know, where Alan got this whole notion of natural inclusion, is not about nodes and nets, because nets are there to trap things. It's about channels and flow.
Yes.
And if you even think about in very sort of our bodies and lungs and hearts, yes. when our hearts, when one of the spaces in our hearts relax, what happens is blood flows in.
Yes.
Blood doesn't decide to flow in. It's the space that invites it, and then it expels. And the same with our lungs, the same with water going into a riverbed. And if we start turning that notion around, then what we do and how we engage in the world begins to change dramatically. You know, leadership is not the thing.
I think that the whole, and the Deleuze and Guattari and people like that with their rhizome theory are in a related field. But I want to turn to Raoul, who wanted to say something earlier on. about this and see what your contribution is to this, Raoul?
Yes, I think very simple. What comes to my mind is something that Mazzucato has been talking about mission economics. And it looks to me that HS2 is a significant, large project that would benefit out of some kind of mission recognition, where organization, at the same time as different players in different aspects of society, it can come together. And somehow, the way I have seen the conversation so far is very much focused on the project itself, or some aspects connected to that, that what I haven't recognized and I'm proposing to think a little bit about is the organizational side, where you have plenty of agents in the environment, plenty of agents in government, and you start to build up the kind of connections and links that will empower all these agents in the direction of achieving a goal, which is in this case a goal that has to be built up by all the participants and not by particular people in positions of power. So I would like to see far more of a conversation around building up networks of organizations in the private and the public sector. I would like to see far more recognition of the relevance of the third sector, of communities, in giving way to these kind of very large projects in societies that have to be somehow democratic and not imposing the views of some few in positions of power in the government. So altogether, the proposition or the way I'm thinking is mission economics, building up networks, connecting public and private sector, building in the influence of the third sector, and getting with that a much more richer understanding of what this project HS2 is all about.
Thank you. Anyone? Emma, are you there? Isabel, are you there? Would you like to say something?
I am here, and it's really lovely to be here with you all today. And apologies, my video's not on. My Wi-Fi is
doesn't have to be on.
Struggling, but nice to see some faces. And it's my first time joining a Cybernetics meeting, so I'm really enjoying just listening today. But it's interesting for me because I graduated from UCL in 2018 studying a BSc in geography, and one of our modules was on kind of critical urbanisms, and our case study was HS2. And a lot of the themes that are kind of being talked about today, we actually touched upon. So it's really quite lovely several years later to hear that in the conversation. So yes, good to be listening and to be part of the group today.
Thank you. So Emma is here. Does that mean Emma wants to say something?
Hello, just to say hello, and it's been really interesting to listen to. I've got, I don't know, it seems like infinite numbers of teenage boys marauding. So we're having quite a complex thing around our relationship with the law and coronavirus and bubbles and how to be 15, and that's everything that's going on. And Ava wants to say hello. Hello. There you go.
Hello.
So I've been listening in, but I felt for everyone's sanity, including my own, I would stay muted and hidden.
All right. Thank you very much. So what I'd like to propose, I wrote a book on self-development, so I'm all up for the idea of individual agency, autonomy, self-development, and so on. I've worked a great deal around organizational systems that enable people to take responsibility because they know what's going on, they know their place, and they understand. So for me, those kinds of aspects of the conversation so far are really important. But so much, I think, of an effective analysis is about avoiding an either-or. To me, it's unimaginable to have a modern world without good infrastructure. It's unimaginable to have a modern world, and I'm going to come back and say what I mean by modern world, but a modern world without road and rail, without communication in some way, without schools, without places where you can live in cities and where you can buy things, places to work, infrastructure, engineering, supply lines. Our whole modern society is built around this infrastructure. And I think that going back and living in caves, well, even the design of caves was a kind of infrastructure, and it's probably not our option. Our option is much more that what we actually need to do is something about our infrastructure. We have to make our infrastructure more fit for purpose. That means sometimes building new, substantial, at scale, national scale, enterprise scale infrastructure. At other times, it may mean dismantling infrastructure that's no longer the right kind. In other cases, it's about finding another alternative. And it seems to me that these involve ethical and moral choices, that every time we make a choice, we are effectively saying this choice has outcomes. Cybernetics is particularly the science that says we design things for outcomes. We become aware of those outcomes. We see what those outcomes will produce in the future. Therefore, in some sense, we are responsible for the choices that we make. And in the process of making them, we're responsible for where they go. So we're engaged in a task which needs to involve social ecology, natural ecology, and other things to change the context for living of the human being. Every single living thing has a context for its life. And what the human being uniquely does, beavers and so on also create their context for living when they build dams, but we have a unique capacity to design worlds without it all being inbuilt and instinctive. But I don't think we're very good at it. So what we're really concerned is trying to build up in imagination a picture of what kind of world are we trying to build for ourselves, and how do we go about building it in an effective way. Because it's not good enough today.
Yeah, I just wrote something in the chat that I think the work of Christopher Alexander is very relevant to these kinds of questions. So
indeed he is, yes.
Yeah, I would recommend to anyone to
say some more about it, and say some more about Christopher Alexander. It's certainly relevant.
What he's an architect, not an IT architect, but a real architect of buildings, and all his life he has been developed actually a kind of way to do his kind of work, building buildings, building neighborhoods, lots of houses, universities, all kinds of things. And he does this by what he calls the living process. And that is actually my earlier remark. Look at what is it that we're building, have that in focus, but unfolding it along the way. So at every step of the way, decide what is the next best step to take. And that involves looking at the environment. He always starts with the people that should live somewhere, or that are and he looks at the landscape, at that sort of thing. But every time he's thinking, what is the next big step? And he doesn't look only at how a building should look, but also how it should be engineered, also how it should be financed, all these things. It's all one thing, and it unfolds. So if you would do this for the HS2, you would start with something. Well, we think we might start with a railway to connect north and west, and you start to talk to people, think about this problem, and maybe you come to the conclusion, no, we don't need to connect London, we should connect the northern cities, but it's all part of this process. And along the way, you have to make decisions, you build something, and in the end, you have an unfolded thing. It's the process is the creation. It's all one thing. So it's very holistic. And when I started reading book 2, I threw it away in disgust. I thought this is nonsense, but then I picked it up. There's really something there, I think, and it's really very relevant to this conversation. So.
Yes, so he's concerned with the integration of quality through all levels of detail and scale. And it's probably worth remembering that a human body is way more complex than all the infrastructure of Britain. All the built infrastructure of Britain is simpler in its structuring than a single mouse. We don't even have to go to the human being. Please, someone else.
Can I jump?
James.
So one thing about these large infrastructure projects that makes them predetermined to fail is that politicians love things that happen way after they're dead or left. So when you've got a project which is 25 years long, no one's going to get the can for it, apart from, oh, it's on an overrun. But they absolutely love that kind of stuff. So, and that helps it to fail. But to try and integrate some of the things that were being said, and to pick up on what Benjamin was saying about Rory Sutherland and his alternatives, one of the alternatives that sort of arose in my mind, shall we say, due to COVID, was that if we're talking about infrastructure, what we could do is we could improve our connectivity, okay, our digital infrastructure. There's technology coming along which will make it possible to look sideways and think you're seeing your colleague, your virtual reality, where you can literally pass something across them. It already exists to an extent. So what if, as an alternative to trying to shuttle everybody around the country at between 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the day, we were to have local hubs? Not everybody can work at home, we know that. But what if you had a local hub? What if you had an office space, a short cycle ride away from where you live, a couple of miles away? So your commute was to a pod that you could work in, or a place you could work with all the digital infrastructure. You would then be working locally. You'd then be removing all the damage from the planet that we're told we're doing because of traveling around by car. You'd also then be meeting people from your local community. Whilst you'd be working with your colleagues around the world, you would then be meeting in the cafeteria or in the coffee shop the people locally that at the moment you don't know who the heck they are because you're traveling however many miles to work. You'd spend your money locally within the population, so your cafes and your pubs and your restaurants, and you would get what the government are supposedly looking for, which is spreading the money away from London and leveling everybody up, because people would then be able to live where they wanted to, and they'd be involved in the local communities. You'd remove an hour a day, 2 hours a day commuting. People would be able to spend more time with their family, more time in the local community. So if we look at the problem from a different perspective, from the Rory Sutherland perspective of supermodels handing out champagne, wouldn't that
male and female? He was clear to specify.
So supermodels, male and female.
For all tastes, that was the point.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just making a joke. Sorry.
So if one was to do that, would that be an alternative? Would that be a better alternative? And therefore, if it possibly is, why would you carry on down an HS2 route? And is it really for us that they're doing it?
Anyone want to challenge James?
Well, I hardly a challenge. Clearly what James is talking about is part of the answer, and more of this localist stuff. with potentially, you know, more complete virtual reality will be good. I don't believe it's ever going to be quite as good as being in a room with another person, especially when things are at the most tense and requiring diplomacy. Perhaps, I suppose somebody ought to sort of stand up for politicians and the dilemmas of politicians who have to do things which might get them re-elected. And if some parts of the population feel particularly needy, whether they actually are or not, then releasing, grabbing, redistributing resources in one area and getting, you know, a 51% majority in your own area is what you will do. I don't think democracy is a particularly good system, but I do think it's better as far as I can see than all the others, despite all the wonderful things that China is apparently doing with its infrastructure. At the moment, we have very long drawn out decisions, and maybe that saves us from several more disasters than high-speed 2 might be. I mean, why are people taking over bits of the Amazon off the indigenous people there? It's very easy to say, if only the rest of the world would settle with a kind of economic lifestyle well below my own, then everything would be hunky-dory. You know, if the population were what it was when I was born, about a third of what it was now, we could behave in various ways without decimating the terrestrial vertebrates that have gone in my lifetime. But until we start giving, I don't know, other vertebrates votes and so on, I think while people continue to feel needy, now you can try persuading them not to feel needy, but they're going to make comparisons as well. So it's a tough number that politicians are facing, and they will go for the easiest fix that the electorate will, I guess, will put up with.
Thank you, David. So you bring another aspect, and one of the characteristics of this conversation is that there have been a number of different approaches and aspects. More could be brought in. You know, someone could say, well, look at all the incredible advantages of the densification of cities and all of the benefits that actually brings, and there are innumerable benefits that come from that kind of dense structure. Someone else could talk about something else, and someone else about something else. So we could, and in a way, a lot of the problems that occur is because different points of view are brought and they dance about and they end up being in conflict or rejected or whatever. In the last part of our time, I'd like us to explore what are the tools that cybernetics offers to actually help us to navigate this process. For example, I mentioned situation. Sitting with situation is the notion of context. What is the context of what we're doing? Another one is feedback, and we've hardly talked about the process of feedback. Another one is recursion. There have been reference to recursion in a certain way at the level, for example, of having individuals as active agents able to do things. But we haven't really explored the various ways in which recursive organization and recursive structures of governance and design might fit into this. The notion of different kinds of no relativity, that you can have every point that you take into account multiple points of view in looking at your aspects. Conversation theory.
Angus, I've got my hand up. Can you hear me?
Looks like he's dropped out of connection.
Oh, okay. Well, I've got my hand up, so I'll speak. What I was going to say to Angus and everyone else is that the more I've listened to our discussion today, the more convinced I am that both cybernetics and systems thinking, cybernetics and systems have much to offer. I mean, I've worked in various contexts, education and working with the military and so on, and I've seen poor management all over the place. I've seen projects go wrong. I worked on one project with the military. They spent £1 million on an e-learning solution, and after 1 year they threw it all away because they were working with the wrong model. They didn't have the right expertise. They hadn't done their homework. So such simple things foul things up. So we can look to the cybernetics for general principles, certainly, and tools. The general principles include things like, from Stafford Beer, being holistic. Looking at which follows on following on from that, I've got 5 laws or principles of observation and action. First one is there is always a bigger picture. Second one, there's always another level of detail. Third one, there is always another perspective. Fourth one, there is always error. Fifth one, there is always the unexpected. Now, if we live with those principles and try to be holistic, then it means we have some humility about what we're doing. We try to listen and learn. We try to listen and learn from each other, and we look for the right places to help manage all the variety that we're surrounded by. We look for the expertise in the right quarters. And there's a general principle from Louis Couffy now from 1956. Cybernetics is the art of assuring the efficacy of action. So we have to encourage people to ensure that what they're doing is going to have the right outcomes. But before we do that, we need to decide what the right outcomes should be. So there should always be some humility about what we're doing and why we're trying to do it. I've just seen too many, that's my plea really, too much bad stuff going on. The world needs cybernetics like never before. Thank you.
Can I say, I think talking about cybernetics, the definition that Stafford Beer gave for cybernetics was the science of effective organization. And in effect, the point I was making earlier was that we need to have some leadership in terms of the directions that we want society to move towards, but at the same time, we need to build up effective organizational structures that would help to build up HS2 in a direction that is somehow related to the interest of society, is related to the concerns of localities, and as a result of that, we have a very complex and a large organizational system there that needs to be made more effective. And that's what I would propose as a way to move ahead.
Thank you, Rod. I'd like to say something more about it. I've been reading Elliot Jack's. He has a handbook about management, effective management. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Elliot Jack's, but he makes a nice distinction between associations, which are collectives of people who come together to decide to do things. And then he talks about managerial accountability hierarchies, which are the organizations which are created to get jobs done. So in the case of HS2, for example, we've got Parliament, we've got various associations, various collectives all around the country, around the world with the bigger problems, discussing what needs to be done, trying to agree what needs to be done. And then there is the separate concept of the organization which is created, the managerial accountability hierarchy, which is employed, paid to get the job done. But there needs to be expertise in the creation of the goals within the associations, you know, the collectives, the communities that come together to discuss what's done, and then to decide who or what kind of organization can get the job done. But all of this has to be managed by, so it's just a distinction between the two aspects. One, the collective decisions about what's to be done, and then the creation or the employing of the hierarchies, the organizations which do the work, which of course have to be overseen by a board of directors or something like that. But and one of the golden rules is to try to separate the CEO from the chairman of the board, but that's not always possible. Just some extra thoughts. I'll put it another way, we're all part of the larger association, and we're trying to agree what it is we would like to have done. And certainly with respect to HS2, I don't think see any agreement amongst the collectives of people who are at the end of the day paying for it to be done. You know, the project's been hijacked by various voices, and of course those who are employed to do the work are only too happy to do the work. We've seen this time again. Once people are asked to do a project, they will get on and do it, and they will, you know, get paid for it.
I think one thing I often think about, a bit of a perhaps elephant in the room, is it is actually politics. So what is going to be the mechanisms for change? Or to be a little bit more neutral, what are the affordances? I mean, I'm going to be doing a presentation in a different environment in a few weeks' time. And when we have our breakout room, I'm going to ban the word should. So instead of saying we should do this, we should do the other, what is actually possible? Now, James Bryant, I think, hinted at this earlier when he talked about this government that has got totally closed ears to any kind of feedback or conversation or consensus. It is totally ideologically driven. So in that context, what are the affordances? What are the mechanisms for change?
Well, given the state, I got in fractionally first. I'd say if we look around what's happening at the moment in the bigger pictures, we have Extinction Rebellion taking one particular approach. We've got Greta Thunberg, and we've got people trying to put people on the moon or on Mars. You know, which organisation would you like to subscribe to? You know, the fools who are trying to conquer space, or those who are, you know, with a good scientific understanding, trying to save the planet for mankind.
And of course, I'm a bit of a hypocrite here. I've got my glass of wine, you can't see it, but and immediately after this, I'll probably go and watch TV or listen to some music and polish off the bottle. I'm not very political, and I am quite lazy, and I think I'm deeply flawed in that way. But I do think, how far am I also typical?
You probably are. I have been guilt-tripped into spending most of this afternoon pushing bits of paper into people's letterboxes for a political party I have very little faith in at all, but more faith than the other political parties for the local elections. And I think we all know that the word idiot derives from the ancient Greek's word for people who were just by themselves, not taking an action, participating in community affairs. And we've got the sort of traditional sort of biosocial question of the free rider. Now, what can we do about this? We can spread values to a certain degree. We can pass on information about how worthy or low otherwise we are. We can try and persuade people that it's actually fun to be part of a political group, which is occasionally the case. But I mean, personally, I'm very happy to have other people decide how to design the sewer systems and a whole load of other things for me, if they will do it in my interests equally with everybody else. Unfortunately, this is not typically, you know, the case very often. I spent hundreds of hours of my life on the train between Manchester and London, and it's very enjoyable. And in my adult lifetime, the journey is 20 minutes shorter than it was when I was a student, which I don't think is doing a great deal more for me. And if I were a business man, a woman, whatever, I honestly think with laptops and so on, that's not going to make much difference. So yeah, you can keep reframing these things, but general principles are good, but as soon as you do have to get into details eventually, and it does become a lot messier, and the nexus of interest at the moment, I live on other people's labour because I'm primarily funded by a pension, and you know, I point out to millennials that, you know, us baby boomers are ripping them off by having inflated house prices, etc., and so on. But if they can't be bothered to vote, then hey, you know, what do they expect? You know, just wait for granddad or granny to die. But it's I mean, we've talked about the wider sets of values and needing to change values, but it depends how desperate you are. There have been times in my life when all I could do was sort of my main job and yeah, look after my family. There are other times when now I feel free to interfere in everybody else's business, and that's a great privilege. And if you're free to do the same, you ought to.
David, may I come back to you about the concept of well, I believe general principles are very, very useful, and that if they're expressed simply, then they can be understood.
But not sufficient.
But, no, of course not. But one of the general principles is, and this is an echo of, well, first of all, from Gregory Bateson, there's a general principle which he calls one of his axioms of communication: one cannot not communicate in a social setting. You might sit in a corner saying nothing, but you're giving out messages. Generalize that. One cannot not do politics. And this goes back to, you know, thinkers like Michael Oakeshott pointing out that the business of politics, fighting over reproduction rights and territory, is pre-human. It happens in all species. So at that level of politics, we are all doing politics all the time.
Yeah, but you could do nothing and allow me to oppress you. You are doing politics there. You're allowing me to get away with it. And I guess I would try and urge people
well, it's a message to give people, say, oh, I'm not interested in politics. We're in an age where everybody, we wish everybody become more educated, more informed, with a greater sense of responsibility. So we need to cut through the garbage, as it were, all the irrelevancies, the minutiae, the silly sound bites, and make clear statements about what's happening. What's happening is the species as a whole is at risk of future survival. Everyone is involved, everyone has a part to play. So, you know, one cannot not do politics, one cannot put your head in the sand.
Can I just jump in though? With COVID, they identified that there are 19 different personality types that have emerged in response to. So if you consider COVID to be a force of disturbance and people's response to COVID a force of control, there are 19 different behavioural responses to COVID that they've identified. Only one or two of which are the ones of, I won't go out and infect other people, I'll keep my head down and I'll listen to what I'm being told. Some of them are, I'll go out and lick bits of a bus so that other people get COVID when they touch it with their hands, or go and cough in other people's faces. So the problem in some ways is that what you or I or David or whoever might think is normal, other people's interpretation, their very neurology interprets it in a way that you or I might not even begin to understand and think it facetious, but for them, it's actually enabling them to survive and thrive and fulfill whatever purpose they feel they have. And that's one of the problems I think that we have. There are more and more different views which everyone, you know, everyone's rights are to have their own views, but some of those views are very contrary to some other people's views. And the big challenge I think we have going forward, in my view, is how we balance all these competing points of view and what we're calling human rights. And you know, it's a curate's egg.
James, we're back to the need for education and information and people learning to be responsible. And this starts from birth. What you call I'm a psychologist. I've been doing psychology in one way or another for 50 years, what you call personality is always a mix of temperament, what the child is born with as a biological being, and the culture, their experiences of the nature and nurture. And we have enormous failings within our culture which produce, you know, psychopathology, sociopathology, and so on. Not all of it is down to biology, but these are understandable problems, and these are things which are happening. Just to say everyone has a point of view and they need their point of view, that's not good enough. You have to say,
well, okay, put it down to neurology, Bernard. If you take it from a neurological perspective, when you communicate with someone who is wired in a way that they cannot actually process what you're saying to them in the way that they don't understand your perspective. Literally, I mean, if you take people that are on the spectrum, you can educate them as much as you like,
okay,
in what you think is right, but it doesn't work for them because they're wired in a different way. Now, they're an extreme version of what we might call normal. So
James, this is where you need to data. First of all, who are these people who say these are these 19 types? That's a research project carried out by some people that have been given money to do things. It's in a larger context. And when you quote the spectrum, at the extremes of the spectrum of disability, learning disability, autism, what you call it, there are individuals with such serious problems like self-harming and harming others that they are locked away in special schools and institutions. Society manages the variety at the extremes as best it can, as it always has done, and in the areas where it's possible, there is you know, a caring management going on, or an education management go on, or a meeting of special needs. That's why we have education systems and social systems. It's not about rights in that sense at all. Rights are balanced against the needs of society to maintain itself. So anyway,
it's all that is true, Bernard, but it's a great individual strategy to deplore the behaviour of other people, and we're far better at seeing other people's flaws than our own. Speaking, as I said, as the son of a sixth child, a third child is a resource grab. Sometimes we do resource grabs by trying to persuade people that they're not worthy of a particular salary because they haven't got as many academic qualifications we have. There are a whole panoply of these things. Are some people evil, and should they be stopped? Absolutely, but from the point of view of all the other life forms on this planet, I might argue that coronavirus is highly functional, something which, if Bentham only applied his principles to wider than the human race, would be seen as a positive contribution to the planet. We're not going to get wiped out. Even Lovelock says there'll at least be a few hundred breeding pairs left on the planet. I mean,
that's wonderful news for the other.
Yeah. But I mean, how much do you care about other whales and that?
David,
I mean, maybe we could do it by greening some of the deserts.
David, I have to go in a moment. Just let me finish with one thought, because you're going down into a whole range of weeds. I grew up in a family of 5, and I was taught to share. You know, if I didn't share, I got a clip round here, but I shared, and I still share. You can say that was my culture. But the general picture of what we're all discussing now, science, please, let's be scientific. Let's refer to evidence that's justifiable, and let's use logic. You know,
but you can't get aught from his, said Hume. Maybe he was wrong.
Well, you can get aught from it, but you get to the point where you make on the basis of the evidence and the logic, you make choices. And there are some questions which are undecidable. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but we choose to believe certain options. So that's where we take responsibility, how we weigh up the evidence and the logic, and then as individuals choose the answers to undecidable questions. We are not going to come up with the solution or the solutions. It's an ongoing journey, which at the best is about staying afloat.
I mean, I'm not necessarily sure about the logic there. I mean, I admit that I might have a personality defect here, but I mean, one of my peccadillos is I love for travel, and I love basically flying business class. I'm quite well aware of global warming, but what is going to stop me flying business class is not logic, but when the prices double, when they actually start taxing aviation fuel, and a flight to Singapore doesn't cost $2,000 but costs $5,000, then I'll stop. And I think this actually almost brings us back around to this question. Was the real question about HS2, about in some ways related to the ecology? Just think about France. It's now illegal in France to fly on a plane where you can go on the TGV for 2 hours. If there's a train journey that takes 2 hours, you're not allowed to fly. So there is a sense here that maybe, and maybe this is a chance to pivot it now, let's take it as a sunk cost that this HS2 will be built. Its current route is just, doesn't seem to fulfill any solution. Reroute it so that you connect with Stratford, so that you can actually go from Manchester to Paris direct. Rethink about, you know, replacing aeroplanes. So when I used to be a consultant and I'd fly to Edinburgh every week, so in some ways, right, I don't really operate according to logic. I operate according to certain external cues.
Allow me to come back to you on that one, Malcolm. Okay, there is a logic to the situations, but you're choosing to be irrational.
Maybe.
And this is what happens as a collective, as a society. We use our politics as best we can to establish rules, principles, and so on, so that if there is a logical way of doing things which is good, the laws and the rules reinforce those. And they would, in the case of your irrational behavior, wanting to fly aeroplanes, and which is one of the most polluting things that we've got going at the moment. One airplane flight is worth a year's worth of driving a car, for example. I love my cars. I'm irrational.
I don't have a car.
But we have, well, I have two. But we have to have the rules which stop those of us who are being irrational from being irrational.
No, but don't you see the problem here? One person's rationality is another person's irrationality.
Exactly.
When SUVs are banned from London, I will consider not flying.
Logic and evidence is science.
Yeah, but driving two cars has a certain equivalence to my flying business.
Oh yeah, I'm irrational on that.
So Bernard, how do you explain the people that think when they get an injection for a vaccine for COVID, they're being injected with a microchip to be traced by the government? You know, there's all the logic and science that we're all aware of, but they're unconvincible. Well, there isn't some conspiracy.
Mostly they are very, 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 very poorly educated about what science is, what evidence is, how vaccines work and so on. I once met a woman, she was middle class, well-spoken, she was quite well off from her business, but she happened to be extreme right wing. When I engaged her with a deeper conversation, I discovered that she believed that black people and white people are different species.
Yeah.
She was pathetically ignorant of the basic biology. We're down to foundational ignorance, and it's back to education, information, and the need for collective responsibility. This is why we have police, why we have.
But on the other side of it, Bernard, I mean, people I grew up with, and I went through a reasonably good education system. Some of those believe in God. Well, and I don't.
James, Bernard and myself, James, I'm afraid.
Yeah. But James, the belief in God, whether it is a classical, undecidable question. You cannot prove there isn't a God, and I cannot prove there is.
But if I go down a scientific route, I think I pretty much can rely on the science that it's a load of baloney.
No, you can't. No. This is why you don't understand what is meant by an undecidable question is one which cannot be proved right or wrong using scientific methods.
But that's all questions, Bernard.
You can't prove right or wrong by scientific methods. I mean, I got really hammered in my fever on this. I mean, basically, if you accept a kind of utilitarianism, all people are equal, that is a very useful sort of rule of thumb to generate a whole plethora of moral to be at the bottom, because there's more space there. But you know, I keep coming in with this line. It's about how people validate one another and say this is valid, this is logical, this isn't. It's a pretty difficult job. Why do people believe absurd things? Partly it's solidarity with the group, surely sociological studies should have. If you're part of a little group which believes something different from the rest of society, you get lots of wonderful, rewarding feelings from your subgroup. And yeah, I mean, you could say people with minority opinions should get out more, but obviously, initially, there is a minority which is right.
Wouldn't that apply just as much to modern scientists as to any other small subgroup?
Yeah.
Well,
sometimes minority subgroups are right.
Sometimes they
I mean,
are. Yes.
look at Andreas Vesalius. You know,
I just want to say, first of all, that we had a power failure. Probably that was reported to you, as a result of which the computer carried on, but the router to the internet fell down, which is a really ironic example of the importance of infrastructure. So apologies for leaving you all. I don't know how you got onto the question of the decidability of God from the question about the decidability of HS2 and construction projects, but no doubt by some interesting route. Sorry to interrupt your flow.
It wasn't just
do carry on.
God, it's the existence of undecidable questions, which Claudius one person uses that phrase to refer to questions which only we can decide. Other questions can be decided scientifically by evidence and logic, but there are some questions which only we can decide how we value them, because the evidence isn't there, or it's just not computable.
Well, you know, there's the ancient legend of the in certain traditions, Masonic and others, about the foundation, the beginnings of humanity. That after Adam and Eve were created, in this Masonic temple legends, after Adam and Eve were created, there was a certain amount of jealousy about how this wonderful group of people had been created amongst the angels. And then God put out a challenge and said to the angels, well, can you name all of these creatures on this planet Earth? And they all tried, you know, the various ranks of angels and all the top brass amongst the angels tried, and none of them could actually name these things. So they turned to Adam, and Adam said, well, it's quite easy. That's a this, that's a this, that's a this, and that's a this. And he named everything. And so he demonstrated something. And I bring up this story, not so much for the resurrection of Arcana, but for this point that human beings sometimes have to decide things, don't they?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Angus, and thank you, everyone. I'm getting a bit tired now. I've really enjoyed this free-flowing discussion, which was possible because we're just down to a handful of...
Yeah, thank you, Bernard.
Thanks. I'd love to carry on with these ideas. Well, I'm sure we will, because these are universal questions.
Yes.
Universal interests.
And thanks for the copy of your book, Bernard. It's there on the list.
Oh, please read it. That saved me a lot of time and trouble. Everybody read my book and agreed with me.
So I assume that you came to some kind of conclusion, or did you just find that people left and you came down to the small number? Is it now the time to close this meeting?
Yes,
or
I'm leaving. I'm leaving.
That somebody else wants to bring?
I have to go as well.
Yeah, I think it's time to close the meeting.
Yeah.
It was an open-ended discussion, edifying and fortifying.
Wonderful to see you.
Thank you.
And good, Michael, I see you're here. Good to see you on the call. And welcome again, Emma. And who is with you?
This is Ed.
Hello.
I thought it might be. Hello, Ed. I think you and we're having a conversation, the three of us, shortly. So look forward to that.
We are. Now that we've reduced our background noises, I feel I can leap in with my thoughts that were going along in the background. One, quite early on, one of the issues, which leads on to the other points, is we have difficulty perceiving the lag in the feedback loops that are making the decisions, which ties nicely with what they're making at the end. You're talking about basically unanswerable questions. For example, doing something like HS2, we're trying to predict a chaotic system. I'm trying to build a house that will survive every possible weather condition for the next how many years. I'm trying to build a major infrastructure project to deal with whatever society will exist in 100 years while my infrastructure project still exists. And of course, it's a systemic thing in that whatever I build influences whatever is going to come about. I'm kind of precluding certain outcomes by doing what I do, but not all of them. So
Bernard's put some good comments in there. Undecidable questions.
Undecidable questions.
Yeah, we choose the answers.
So the actions you take change the world for which the actions that you were taking were intended to do something.
Yes.
And then other people are doing things as well. So you get interlocking transformation consequences and unintended consequences.
Second order economics.
My mum once gave me some useful advice when I was younger, and she said, when you're not sure what to do, one of the wisest things to do is to leave yourself with plenty of things that you could do after you've done the thing you do. So I quite like that.
It's a kind of variety equation, isn't it?
Yes. So to her, her advice was always to leave as much variety available to you as possible.
Right.
Yeah. Very cybernetic.
Well, I shall say goodbye and conclude this meeting. And once again, thank you very much for participating. It was a pleasure meeting you. It was not such a pleasure jumping out of the meeting because I missed something, but I'm glad you succeeded in going on. No doubt even better for my absence. Bye-bye.
Well, we will never know, will we?
An unanswerable question.
An undecidable question.